Chapter 8, Political Geography. Key Issue 1. There's the content objectives for each of the 4 key issues. We'll be covering in these notes. Content objective for Key Issue 1. Discuss why it's difficult to define a state or states. I can statements. Explain a shadow belt region and irredentism and give an example to each. 2. Explain why it's difficult to determine if some territories are states. 3. Give at least 3 examples of where there is disputed territories of states on a world scale. 4. Evaluate why the world continues to increase in the number of states and why the size varies. Lastly, describe how most conflicting claims to the polar regions is over natural resources. Here we look at the United States. Is it a state? Yes, it's one state with 50 subdivisions of a state. That's referred back to key issue. Going back to the cultural key issues. All right, let's take a look at the simple definition of political geography. It's interrelation between people, state, and territory. The more complex definition is it's the study of organization and distribution of political phenomena, including the impact on other spatial components of a society and culture. A state. When we look at states today, there are approximately 200 states, although in the 1940s there were about 50. So we've nearly seen the number of states in the last 80 years more than quadruple. When we look at a state, it is a political unit. It has control of its internal and foreign affairs. It has established government that maintains that control. A state also has definitive territory, and they have a permanent population. And we determine that permanent population by citizenship, nationalism. Second, a state has sovereignty, which means independent control of internal and external affairs. A state is synonymous with country. The largest state in the world today is Russia. Russia occupies about 11% of the world's entire land area, whereas the smallest state is called a microstate. Microstates, the smallest microstate is Monaco. However, in some texts, we'll say Vatican is the smallest microstate, Vatican City, and Monaco is the second smallest city. Again, I talked about the proliferation since World War II, expanding the number of states and with sovereignty by almost fourfold. A microstate is a very small land area. There are over 24 microstates in the world. Most microstates are islands. Antarctica is not a sovereign state, and again, it has neither government or a permanent population. The number of sovereign states is contested. Not everyone agrees because of historical disputes, and there are more than one claim to states. For instance, when we look at China, China is composed of the People's Republic of China and Taiwan, the Republic of China, as separate and sovereign states. Taiwan is not sovereign, but as a part of China, according to the Chinese. The government of Taiwan agrees to the claim that Taiwan is not sovereign, but is a part of China, but disagrees on how their internal and external power should be of Taiwan. When we look at the history behind China and Taiwan, in the late 1940s, the nationalists and the communists were fighting for an independent country. In 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists fled to Taiwan, and the entire country of proper China was claimed by the communists in Mao Zedong. The United States has long supported the nationalists because they've often reflected the type of government the U.S. has, democracy, and the type of economic system, mixed economic capitalist economic system. Until the 1970s, when the official government of the United States regarded the government of China as claims to Taiwan. And the United Nations voted to transfer Taiwan's seat from the nationalists to the communists in the 1970s as well. But again, China's claim over the territory has become increasingly aggressive in the last few years. When we look at the Western Sahara, in the Western Sahara, we have the Shawari Arab Democratic Republic, also known as the Western Saharan Country or state. It's considered a state by most African countries. However, through history, the Spanish have controlled the territory of the continent's west coast between Morocco and Mauritania until withdrawing in the middle of the 1970s. And then at that time, Sahrawi Republic was declared by the Polisario Front and recognized by most African countries. But Morocco and Mauritania annexed the northern and southern portions. And then Mauritania withdrew 3 years later, but Morocco claimed the territory. Morocco controls most of the populated area, but the Polisario Front operates in the vast, sparsely inhabited deserts. They occupy 1/5 of the land, which is west of the wall. Meanwhile, Morocco claims all territory as its sovereign country and does not recognize Western Sahara as a sovereign state. Here's a look at Moroccan control, and you see the Polisario Front that claims an independent Western Sahara. Looking at Korea, is it one state or two? Often referred to as the nation divided into two states. Again, the history behind this is, or history behind Korea is that it was a colony of Japan for 35 years until the 1950s, until a war broke out in the 1950s, which ended Japanese control of the Koreas. And it sparked, this war was between the North that sided with the Soviet Union in the era of the superpowers, so they were a communist command economic system, and the South sided with the United States, being a democratic and economic and a capitalist economic system. And then after 3 years of fighting, they ended with a ceasefire known as an armistice. At that, they drew a line along the 48th parallel, and the 48th parallel set up the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, the most heavily militarized border in the world, and it divided the country into two sovereign countries, a North Korea and a South Korea. However, they are one ethnicity, Korean, as we go back to understanding their language tree, knowing that it was an isolated family that evolved into an individual family. So we know that everyone on the Korean Peninsula comes from the same ethnicity. However, when we look at North Korea today, it's a country that's very poor. It lacks the ability to provide for its citizens with food, electricity, and other basic needs. Meanwhile, South Korea is for reunifying is declining, so less and less people want to reunify because in South Korea, younger generations have no memories of the unified country, and they're more advanced. They have a higher standard of living. So many Koreans and South Koreans are losing touch with their generations of when this DMZ was created, or the ceasefire 48th parallel was created, and now peace negotiations have been ongoing since 2018 with no resolve. Here's a look at North Korea and South Korea and how one is going to be vastly more developed, highly developed, versus the North Korea, which is developing, a low developed country. All right, take a moment to reflect on what you've learned. All right, Crimea is an area of the world where we see irredentism. And irredentism is when now you have Crimea that was once part of the newly independent Ukraine now has sided with there's the dominant ethnicity of, um, of Ukrainians, and then you have a minority ethnicity of the Russians or the Slavics. Russia invaded Crimea in 2014 and annexed it without any NATO or world intervention. Let me go back to irredentism. I'm sorry, irredentism is breaking along ethnic lines. So when the Soviet Union fell apart, it broke along ethnic lines that formed the multiple ethnic groups of Soviet Union. Then a shatter belt is very different. The shatter belt is where you have the majority of a country of one ethnicity, and then you have a minority group of minority ethnicity, usually along the border of another country that has the majority of that ethnicity. So for instance, in Ukraine, the eastern side of Ukraine are mostly Russians, not Ukrainians. And so when Russia went to invade Crimea and annex the eastern side of, when they went to annex Crimea, they were able to annex because of the predominant Russian majority. However, in Ukraine, the country of Ukraine, the dominant ethnicity is Ukrainian, and then the eastern side is Russian. So there begs the question of when, or if and when, will the Soviets invade to annex eastern Korea, much like they did the Crimean Peninsula. Another area where there is a shatter belt, so a world event, usually after a major world war, but it can be a major world event, with the 1947 partition plan that divided Pakistan from India along religious and along state lines, is disputing over the Kashmir region in the northeast. The majority are Pakistanis, but India has controlled Pakistan, or India has controlled Kashmir. And again, this would be a region that could be a possible shatter belt with Pakistani invasion, trying to take back the land of Kashmir from India. Another example could be Korea and Vietnam. Looking at the conflict between those two countries and dispute of global superpowers in the 20th century. Again, annexing South Korea to North Korea, or possibly Vietnam, with former communist regions with current democratic regions. Here's a look at the Crimea Peninsula. So again, Russians were able to annex in Crimea in 2014 without international intervention. Another example of disputing states is in the Senkaku, according to the Japanese. The Senkaku Islands, or the Diaoyu Islands, which the Chinese call these islands. Historically, Taiwan is not sovereign, but as a part of China. However, with the islands, it's been claimed by both China, Taiwan, and Japan. The Diaoyu in China and the Diaoyu in Taiwan and the Senkaku in Japan. They're roughly 5 large islands, and they're a collection of 3 rock outcroppings. And Japan has controlled the islands since they claimed them in 1895, except they lost control when Japan was a loser of World War II, and the United States controlled the administration of Japan from 45 to 72. And then Japan's position today is that China never stated claim to the sovereign islands back in 1895. But China's claim goes all the way back to 1895. But both dispute this territory with increased military force, because both China and Japan have established air defense zones in eastern China Sea with conflicting boundaries, as we can see in the next slide. All right, again, we can see the air zones, how they overlapped and are conflicting. But keep in mind, China's foreign policy is that they have sole control of the East China Sea. They control everything in the East China Sea, is their claim, more recently. we can take a look at the Canadian government in the Nunavut territory. They recognize territorial rights, sovereignty of the Indigenous people. That's highlighted here. All right, take a moment and reflect on what you learned today in this lesson. All right, continuing on, let's talk about the polar regions. Several states claim portions of the polar regions. Some claims are overlapping in the South Pole. Argentina, Chile, and the United Kingdom, U.S. and Russia don't recognize any claims to Antarctica. The United Nations Convention of the Sea, known as UNCLOS, opened up submissions for claims of the Arctic Circle, and those submissions had to be submitted to the United Nations Conventions of the Law of the Sea by 2009. And the main reason for these disputes over both polar regions is because of natural resources. Here we can see the claims of Antarctica. It is the only large landmass in the world that is not a sovereign state. And the largest percent is claimed by Canada. Or I'm sorry, it's the size of the state of Canada, and the largest is claimed by Australia. Here's the North Pole. We can see the North Pole, what are above the Arctic Circle. We can see that there's disputed claims still in the legend above. We can see that Canada, Russia, Norway, Denmark, and the United States all claim the right to extract natural resources out of the edge of the continental shelf, and this goes beyond their exclusive economic zones, which are 200 territorial miles from their nearest land border. Here are the laws of the sea. It was signed by 165 countries, so it's standard territory limits within ocean waters. So you have the 12, well, the first you have the internal waters, and those are all waters in the lake-based, it's all landward side of the baseline, no right of passage. So your territorial waters are a part of those internal waters where you can see laws that regulate the usage of those waters. And you have contiguous zone, which is the next 12 nautical miles, and those are laws that enforce pollution, taxation, immigration, and customs. And then you have your economic zone, or your exclusive economic zones, and those are controlling resources such as fish or minerals or energy below the ocean's surface. States do not have control beyond the 200 miles under UNCLOS laws. Right, we can see the territorial disputes of the contiguous waters of Australia. And again, these are problems that arise with territorial disputes of the UNCLOS laws, the overlapping laws of Australia with lesser island micro states of Howell and Norfolk and Tasmania. All right, when we look at the UNCLOS laws, we see overlap with the Spratly Islands. Spratly Islands are overlapping claims, resource claims that encompass Malaysia and the Philippines. Here we have disputed power of the microstates, because the microstates control waterways that are larger than their size of their country. So they've gained new significance, and also it creates overlapping claims with other countries. But when we look at these micro states that are islands, they exert a little bit more control within representation in the United Nations, because as I already mentioned, they're controlling more land area than, in many cases, the size of their country. And more importantly, controlling the economic exclusive zone, minerals and resources and energy. All right, if we have time, we'll take a look at the artificial islands. All right, this is just in review, so to end our notes. Again, make sure you can answer all 12 questions.